Earl Stanton had buried enough people to know what a death cabin looked like from the outside. 2 days after the storm broke, he drove his wagon through drifts that reached the wheel hubs, stopping at every claim within 4 miles of his own. He had already found the burger place, dark and cold, Henrik and Greta alive by luck, and a cord of oak they had been hoarding since October. He had found the Aldrich claim abandoned they had left before the storm, smart people in the Morrison place with a fire going, and 3 children pressed around it like planets around a sun. Then he came to the Holt claim. The cabin sat low in the snow, almost swallowed. The stovepipe was gone entirely, the hole in the roof packed solid with ice, no smoke, no light through the one window which was buried to the sill. The door faced east, and the drift against it stood 5 feet high, untouched, undisturbed. Nobody had gone in or out since the storm hit. Stanton sat on his wagon seat for a moment and did the math that prairie winters forced on a man. Fire out, pipe gone, 2 days at 40 below. He climbed down and started digging. He told himself he was digging for the bodies, a woman and a child 4 years old. He told himself this so the finding would not undo him. He had been undone before in the winter of 1881, and he had not fully recovered from it, and he knew that men who got undone twice in the same way sometimes did not come back from it. So he dug steadily and thought about the bodies and prepared his face for what it would have to do when the door swung open. The door swung open. Agnes Holt stood in the gap, a shawl around her shoulders, her hair loose, her eyes sharp and clear. She looked at him with a particular expression of someone who had been waiting and was mildly irritated by how long the waiting had taken. Her daughter stood at her hip, 4 years old, wrapped in a quilt, holding a cloth doll by one arm. Both of them were breathing. Both of them were warm. Stanton stood in the dugout doorway with a shovel and stared, and Agnes looked back at him with something close to patience, and behind her in the southeast corner of the frozen cabin, he could see the wooden box she had built in September, its pine door standing open, the bedding inside still pressed into the shape of 2 sleeping people. He would think about that moment for the rest of his life. Want the relief of it, though relief came later. What he would think about was the specific quality of her expression, the way she looked at him, as though she were the one who had been waiting to find out if he had survived. 5 months earlier, Agnes Holt had never spent a night on the open Dakota plain. She stepped off the westbound train at Parker Station on the 14th of August, 1887, carrying everything she owned divided between a leather trunk and a carpet bag that had belonged to her mother. The trunk held bedding, 2 dresses, a wool coat, a cast-iron skillet, a small Bible, and a photograph of Thomas Holt taken 6 years before his death, when he still looked like a man who believed the future owed him something. The carpet bag held what remained of their savings, $9.40 in coin, and a letter Thomas had written from Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1886, 8 months before the fever took him. Clara, 4 years old, clutched her mother's hand and said nothing. She had learned on the 3-day train ride from Chicago that asking questions got her no useful answers, and that her mother's silence was not anger, but something harder to name, the silence of a person doing arithmetic in their head that never quite balanced. Parker Station was a platform and a building and a grain elevator, and not much else. The platform held one other person, a man loading sacks onto a freight wagon, who did not look up when the train stopped or when it left. The station agent had a desk and a lamp, and the air of someone who had given the same directions too many times to feel anything about giving them again. Agnes asked about the Holt claim. He pointed east without standing up. 3 miles that direction, follow the wagon ruts until you see a shanty with a caved-in fence. That's the one your husband filed on. He paused, looked at her more carefully. You're the widow. Agnes said she was. Thought so, he said. Your husband never lived out there. Filed the papers in spring, went back to Chicago to fetch you. Fever got him before he could. He shrugged with his shoulders and his face at the same time. Claim's yours if you want it. 6 months to establish residence or it reverts. County recorder's got the paperwork. Agnes asked how much a ticket back to Chicago cost. $11, he said. She picked up the carpet bag. Clara picked up her doll. They walked east. The walk took 2 hours in the August heat. Clara managed the first mile on her own feet and then reached up without asking, and Agnes lifted her and carried her on one hip for the last mile with the carpet bag over the opposite shoulder and the trunk left at the station to be collected later. The prairie stretched in every direction without feature or interruption. No trees, no hills, nothing to catch the eye or break the wind that moved through the gardens in long, slow waves from the northwest. Agnes had grown up in southern Illinois in a county where you could always see a tree or a roof or a church steeple, where the land had enough variation to give a person something to orient toward. Here the sky was the dominant thing. It pressed down from every direction at once, and the grass bent under it, and a person walking through it felt not free but exposed, like something that had wandered into the open and had not yet understood its situation. The shanty appeared on the horizon as a dark smudge and resolved slowly into what it was, a box of rough-cut boards and tar paper 12 feet by 14 feet, listing slightly to the south, as if it had decided that direction long ago and could not be talked out of it. The fence the station agent had mentioned was not caved in so much as it had ceased to exist in any organized way. The posts were there, four of them, but the wire between them had gone slack and lay in the grass like something that had given up. Behind the cabin, stacked against the north wall, was a pile of wood. Agnes set Clara down and walked to the pile and counted. Half a cord, maybe less. Scrap pieces different lengths left by whoever had walked away from this place before Thomas Holt filed his papers on it. She pushed open the cabin door. The interior was dim and smelled of old dust and something animal that had nested there and departed. The floor was packed, earth-hard underfoot. One window glass intact, but filmed with grime, so thick the light came through it, brown rather than clear. A cast-iron cook stove in the northeast corner, its pipe rising through a tin collar in the roof in three sections, each section joined to the next with loops of baling wire, where the metal had corroded and the fit had loosened. Agnes crossed to the stove and put her hand on the pipe. It moved, not the small movement of something slightly loose, the movement of something that was staying in place through habit and wire and nothing else. She applied light pressure to the middle joint. It shifted half an inch and settled back. She looked at the walls. The boards had been cut to fit and nailed in place, and that was the whole of it. Between the boards and places, she could see light, not the filtered light of a gap, but actual daylight coming through cleanly, the way daylight comes through a space wide enough to insert a finger. The wind outside was mild. It found those gaps without effort, without even the sound of effort, and moved through the cabin interior as though the walls were decorative rather than structural. Clara stood in the doorway holding her doll. "Mama, I'm hungry." Agnes had bread and hard cheese in the carpet bag. She fed Clara and ate nothing herself and stood in the door of the cabin and looked out at the 160 acres of grass and dirt that were, according to the Homestead Act of 1862, hers to prove up within 5 years. No well, no barn, no neighbors visible in any direction, though the station agent had mentioned a farm to the north 1.5 miles away belonging to a man named Earl Stanton. She filed that information away without using it yet. She stood in the August heat and calculated the same way Thomas had always said she calculated, without sentiment, without the comfort of hoping the numbers would improve if she looked at them long enough. It was the 14th of August. Winter on the northern prairie began in late October and did not relent until April. 11 weeks. She had $9.40. She had half a cord of scrap wood. She had a 4-year-old who could lift things and carry messages and hold nails in her palm, but could not swing a hammer or work a crosscut saw. She had a cabin that was not a house. It was more precisely a wooden tent with a stove inside, and the stove was connected to the outside air by 3 joints of pipe held together with rust and wire. She went back inside, sat down on the trunk she had not yet unpacked, and read Thomas's letter, for what she calculated was the 37th time. The letter was 3 pages written in Thomas's careful hand, the hand of a man who had taught himself penmanship from a book and was proud of it. He described the land with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had looked at empty space and seen not what was there but what could be built on it. Good soil, he wrote, black and deep, the kind that holds water without flooding. Grass as far as a man can ride. Room for Clara to grow up without walls pressing in on her. He had used the word future 4 times in 3 pages, which Agnes had noticed and which she had decided at the time of reading it, and every subsequent reading was a word that contained more hope than information, but was not for that reason wrong. Thomas was not a man who had been wrong about the important things. He had been wrong about his own health, had not known the fever was coming until it was already in him, had gotten on a train to meet his family, and died in a Chicago boarding house 12 days later, 50 miles from the reunion he had been planning for 8 months. But the land was real. The black soil was real. The 160 acres were real, and they were in Agnes Holt's name now, and they would be Clara's if Agnes could manage the 11 weeks until the county recorder checked off the residency requirement. She folded the letter and put it back in the carpet bag. Then she unpacked the trunk. Earl Stanton arrived on the 17th of August, 3 days after Agnes reached the claim. He came on a gray mare alone, and he tied the horse to one of the surviving fence posts with the ease of a man who had dismounted at this particular property before, though Agnes had no way of knowing whether that was true. He was in his mid-50s, with a face that had been shaped by weather more than genetics, the skin pulled tight over the bones, the eyes habitually narrowed, the hands on the reins large and deliberate. He did not smile when he introduced himself. He did not offer pleasantries. He walked past Agnes into the cabin without asking, and she followed him inside, because it was her cabin and she intended to know what he was doing in it. Clara was asleep in the corner on a folded quilt, the cloth doll tucked under one arm. Stanton looked at her for a moment and then looked away, and the looking away was not disinterest but something more careful. He put his hand on the stovepipe and felt it move. He pressed his palm flat against a gap in the west wall and held it there, feeling the air push through from outside. He walked to the woodpile and stood there for a moment, with his lips moving slightly, the way a man counts silently when the number he's arriving at is not going to be useful. He turned back to Agnes. "You're Thomas Holt's widow." "I am." "Thomas Holt was a fool to file on this claim and a bigger fool to leave you holding it." His voice was flat and uninflected, the voice of a man delivering a measurement rather than an opinion. "This is not a house. This is a coffin waiting for the lid." Agnes said nothing. "You need 15 cords of wood minimum to get through a Dakota winter. 20 is safer. That pile behind your cabin is half a cord of scrap. The nearest timber is Big Sioux Bottoms, 18 miles east. You have no wagon, no team. Even with both, a woman alone cannot cut and haul 15 cords while keeping a child." He gestured at the stovepipe. "That pipe won't last one hard blow. First real wind takes it down, and then you've got a fire in your lap or no fire at all. I can repair it." "With what more wire?" Stanton looked at Clara again, still sleeping, the doll pressed against her cheek. When he spoke again, his voice was the same flat factual without the softness that might have made what he said easier to hear or easier to dismiss. "I lost my first wife in the winter of '81, 2 of my children with her." He said it the way you say a thing you have said many times and have stopped expecting to feel differently about. "The fuel ran out. We couldn't reach town. I sat in that cabin and watched them freeze because I didn't have enough wood, and I hadn't planned for what happened when the wood ran out." He looked at Agnes directly. "I know what it takes to survive out here. You don't have it. Then what should I do? Sell the claim, take what you can get. 15 bond, 20 if you find a buyer who wants the land more than the sense God gave him. Go back to Chicago before the snow flies." He looked at Clara. "That child deserves better than dying in a board shack because her mother was too proud to quit." Agnes felt the words land, the way physical things land, not emotionally exactly, but with weight and location, the way a stone lands on a surface and stays there. She wanted to argue. She had the argument available to her, had been assembling its parts since she stepped off the train, that she had no money for the ticket back, that Thomas had believed in the land, that Clara deserved the future her father had written about in careful penmanship, 3 pages long. But the argument that mattered was not available to her, because the argument that mattered would have to include numbers that supported her position, and the numbers did not support her position. Stanton had just given her all the numbers, and they were his, not hers. "When the real cold comes," Stanton said, moving toward the door, "that child will freeze in her bed, and you will watch it happen. That's not a threat. That's what will happen if you stay. I'm telling you because nobody told me, and I spent a long time wishing somebody had." He walked out. Agnes heard him untie the horse and mount and ride north without looking back. She stood in the doorway and watched the space where he had been until it was just grass and sky again. Inside, the stovepipe shifted in the small wind that moved through the cabin walls, a soft metallic sound, almost gentle, like something trying not to wake the child. She went inside and started making dinner. The idea came 3 weeks later, in the first cold dark of September, at 2 in the morning, with Clara pressed against her side, and the temperature having dropped enough in the night that Agnes could see her breath in the moonlight coming through the window. She had been lying awake for an hour already, doing the same arithmetic she did every sleepless night: cord of wood against days of winter, against dollars in the carpetbag, against the distance to the timber, and the cost of hiring a wagon she couldn't afford. The arithmetic never balanced. She had come to understand that the arithmetic was never going to balance, that she was in a situation where the correct answer to the problem as stated did not exist, and that what she was really trying to figure out was not how to solve the problem as stated, but how to change the problem into one that had a solution. The cold was coming through the walls in the specific way that frightened her most, not as a draft which had a direction and a source, but as a general seeping, a lowering of the temperature in the whole room at once, as if the cold were not entering the cabin, but rather the cabin were being submerged in it slowly. The stove had been burning through the evening. She had let it go low at midnight to save wood. The cabin had been warm enough at midnight. It was not warm enough now, and she had not burned more wood, and that was the problem she had been refusing to fully look at, that even with wood, even with the stove burning, the cabin was losing heat faster than the fire could make it. The room was too big. That was the fact she had been circling. 12 by 14 feet was not in absolute terms a large room, but at 40 below, with air leaking through every gap in the boards, 12 by 14 feet was too much space to keep warm with what she had. She thought about Thomas's letter. Room for Clara to grow up without walls pressing in. She had always loved that image. She had pictured it as a kind of spaciousness, the open prairie, the big sky, the absence of the cramped and crowded tenement blocks of Chicago where they had spent the last 4 years. But lying in the dark with her breath visible and Clara shivering against her, she thought about it differently. Walls pressing in was not always a threat. Sometimes walls pressing in was the point. And then without planning it, without searching for it, she remembered her grandmother's house. Her grandmother had lived in a farmhouse in southern Illinois, 20 miles outside of Springfield, in a house her grandfather had built in 1851 from timber he cut himself. The house had real walls, thick and solid, chinked with clay and horsehair. But in one corner of the main room against the east wall, her grandmother had built something additional, a wooden enclosure 6 feet long, 4 feet tall, with a door that latched from the inside. Her grandmother had called it the sleeping box. She had built it herself in the winter of 1863 when Agnes was 7, when her grandfather was in the Union Army somewhere in Tennessee, and the farmhouse was her grandmother's alone to manage with 3 grandchildren and a fuel supply that the winter of that particular year was doing its best to exhaust. Agnes had slept in that box as a child. She remembered the specific quality of the warmth inside it, not the warmth of the stove, which came and went and had direction, but a different kind of warmth roundish, close the warmth of being inside something small enough that the small amount of heat you produced yourself was enough to fill it. She remembered her grandmother explaining it with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who had figured something out and saw no reason to be mysterious about it. The box holds your heat, the room loses it, stay in the box. She had said it without drama, the way you explain to a child that water runs downhill. Agnes sat up in the dark. Clara made a small sound but did not wake. The cabin was 12 by 14 feet, 1,000 cubic feet of air to heat, give or take, with gaps in every wall, letting that heat bleed away into the prairie, dark as fast as the stove could make it. Stanton was right. No amount of wood was going to solve that problem, not at 40 below, not with that stovepipe. But a box 6 feet by 3.5 feet by 4 feet, was 84 cubic feet, 12 times smaller. 2 people generating heat in 84 cubic feet with walls and blankets to hold it in. She couldn't heat the room. She had understood that for weeks without quite letting herself understand it. Maybe she didn't have to heat the room. Maybe she only had to heat the box. In the morning, she walked the claim looking for materials. The collapsed lean-to behind the cabin had looked promising when she first arrived, but she had known from the moment she touched the first board that the wood was rotten through. It crumbled when she pressed it, returned to the earth it was trying to become. She walked the rest of the 160 acres with purpose, grid style, the way her father had taught her, to search for something specific in a large space, divide the area into sections, work each section completely before moving to the next trust. The method more than the instinct. Half a mile south, she found what remained of a small outbuilding, a storage structure of some kind, perhaps for tools built at some point before the main claim was filed and abandoned when whoever built it moved on. The roof had collapsed inward years ago, and 2 of the 4 walls had followed it, but the 2 remaining walls were pine 1-inch boards, weathered gray but solid when she dug her thumbnail in and tested. She walked the perimeter of what was left and counted. Enough for 2 walls, maybe 3 if she was careful about cuts and did not waste. She had no saw. She walked north 1.5 miles to the Stanton farm. It was a larger operation than her own, a real house with a second story, a barn that looked like it had been built to last 2 outbuildings in reasonable repair, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the coming winter, with straw mulch over the beds. A woman answered the door, Margaret Stanton Earl's wife, perhaps 45, with a steady way of looking at a person that suggested she had long ago stopped being surprised by what people showed up at her door needing. Agnes explained what she needed, a handsaw, to borrow not to keep. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Earl says you should sell and leave. I know what Earl says. Are you leaving? I can't afford to leave. Margaret considered this. Something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, but recognition. The recognition of one person's specific situation by another person who has inhabited enough situations to know the shape of this one. She went inside and came back with a handsaw and a small hammer with a short handle. Agnes had not asked for the hammer. I hope what you're building keeps you alive, Margaret said. She did not say it with any particular conviction. She said it the way you say the thing that needs to be said when the thing you believe is different and you have decided for your own reasons not to say that. Agnes walked back south with the saw and the hammer. Clara was waiting at the cabin door as Agnes had left her with instructions to stay inside and call out if anything frightened her. Nothing had frightened her. She was sitting in the grass outside the door anyway, her doll in her lap, watching a grasshopper on a stem. The sawing took 2 full days. Agnes was not a carpenter and had never claimed to be. But she had grown up on a farm in southern Illinois with a father who built and repaired things as a matter of survival, rather than craft, and who had let her watch and then help and then do, because that was how her father understood education to work. She knew how to set a saw at the right angle and let the weight of the blade do part of the work. She knew that forcing a cut made it crooked and wasted the effort. She knew to mark her lines with a nail and a straight edge before she started so that the measuring was done before the doing, and the doing could be deliberate. Her hands blistered inside the first hour. The blisters broke by the end of the first afternoon. She wrapped them in strips torn from an old petticoat and kept cutting. Clara brought her water twice and sat beside her in the grass and watched, and once fell asleep in the afternoon sun with her head on Agnes's thigh, and Agnes kept cutting without shifting her position. At the end of the second day, she had boards. Enough boards for the 2 new walls she needed. She carried them back to the cabin in 3 trips over the course of the next morning, each trip requiring her to navigate a half-mile of uneven grass with her arms full and her hands wrapped in cloth that was stiffening with dried blood. She chose the southeast corner of the cabin for the box, the corner farthest from the door where 2 existing walls would serve as the back and one side of the structure. She would build 2 new walls of pine and a door that hinged open. The design was simple because it had to be. Every joint was a decision made without precedent. Every angle was her best estimate. But she had her grandmother's dimensions in her memory as precisely as if she had written them down: 6 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, 4 feet high. A door that latched from inside. She had those measurements, and she had the boards, and she had the small hammer Margaret Stanton had put in her hand without being asked, and she started building. Ruth Connell appeared on the 4th day of construction. She was a substantial woman, 38 years old, practical in her dress and in her manner, born in Pennsylvania and transplanted to Dakota by a husband who had believed the land reports in the Chicago newspapers with the specific credulity of a man who wants badly to believe something. Ruth and Daniel Connell farmed a claim almost 2 miles east, which on the Dakota prairie qualified as neighboring. She had seen Agnes hauling lumber across the south field and had walked over to see what was happening, because on the open prairie, unusual activity by a neighbor was the kind of thing you investigated partly out of curiosity and partly because in a landscape this empty other people's trouble had a way of becoming your own. She walked around the half-built frame in the corner of the cabin, running her hand along the boards, examining the joints with the eye of someone who had watched a lot of structures go up and come down. What is this, a sleeping box? My grandmother built one when I was a child. Ruth's hand stopped on the frame. I know what a sleeping box is. My aunt had one. In a proper house with stone walls and a fireplace that ran all winter. She turned to face Agnes. This is a board shanty. Your walls are paper. A sleeping box works when the walls of the building around it hold some heat. Your walls hold nothing. The box isn't meant to use the building's heat. It's meant to hold mine. Ruth looked at her steadily. Body heat. My grandmother said the box holds your heat. The room loses it. She wasn't wrong. Agnes, you have half a cord of wood in winter in 6 weeks. You should be cutting hay to twist into fuel. You should be getting to Stanton on your knees if you have to and asking him to haul you timber on credit. You should not be building furniture. It's not furniture. Then what is it? Agnes set down her hammer. A place to survive when the stove fails. The words sat in the small room between them. Ruth looked at the stovepipe. She looked at it the way Agnes had been looking at it for 3 weeks, with the understanding that it was not a question of whether it would fail, but of when and how cold the night would be when it did. When, Ruth said, not a question, confirming she had heard the word. First hard wind, maybe the second. Ruth shook her head. She did not do it unkindly, which was in some ways worse than unkindness. If you're wrong about this box, it won't just fail you. It's the place where they find you. She looked at Clara, who was sitting inside the unfinished frame, playing at being in a house, arranging her doll against the pine wall. Both of you. Agnes picked up the hammer. Then help me make sure I'm not wrong. Ruth did not help. She stood in the cabin for another half-minute, looking at the frame, at Clara inside it, at Agnes with the hammer. Then she walked out without saying goodbye. She came back 2 days later with 6 eggs and a jar of blackberry preserves. She did not mention the box. She sat at the plank table Agnes had assembled from scrap boards and drank the weak coffee Agnes offered and talked about the weather and the price of flour in Parker and how her husband Daniel's knee had been giving him trouble since August. When she left, Agnes noticed she had looked at the frame once from the doorway on her way out. She didn't say anything about it, but she had looked. Agnes walked to Parker in the following weeks 4 miles each direction, 8 miles round trip, which she managed in a full day if she started early and didn't rest. The trip was for nails and the brass hinges the door would need. 40 cents for the hinges, 35 cents for a pound of nails. That left her with $7.90. On another trip into town, Wallace Pruitt was in the store. She had seen Pruitt once before on the road back from her first Parker trip when he had reined his horse and looked down at her and Clara from the height of a man who owned 800 acres and 3 grown sons and had built all of it without asking anyone's permission. He had offered her $20 for the claim, 20, not the 15 she had heard he'd started with, and she had refused, and he had ridden on without visible anger, which had been in its way more unsettling than anger would have been. He was standing at the counter when she came in talking to the storekeeper about the price of winter wheat. He let the conversation trail off when he noticed her in the way that men with a certain kind of confidence let conversations trail off, not because the conversation isn't worth continuing, but because their attention has moved and they expect the room to follow it. Still building out there, he said it to the room rather than to her, which was its own specific technique. Rode past your claim yesterday, saw the lumber. He addressed the 2 farmers examining seed packets near the window as much as he addressed Agnes. A sleeping box, like something you'd build for a child. He turned to the storekeeper. That stovepipe of hers is hanging by threads. Anybody who's ridden past has seen it. I'm not saying anything I haven't said before. That claim will be empty by February. She can build whatever she likes in that shanty. When the pipe goes, she'll find out what the cold means. His voice dropped slightly, becoming almost reflective, almost sad. I just hope she has the sense to make other arrangements for the girl before that happens. Otherwise, the county's going to be burying 2 people in the spring, and nobody here is going to feel good about it. No one in the store spoke. The farmers did not look up from the seed packets. The storekeeper arranged something on the counter. Agnes paid for her hinges, and her nails counted out exact change and walked out. The walk back was 8 miles. The first mile she cried, not from what Pruitt had said or not only from that, from the accumulated weight of the weeks since August. the exhaustion that lived in her hands and her shoulders, in the part of her mind that never stopped running the arithmetic. The loneliness of being certain that you might be wrong about the only plan you have. She cried for exactly 1 mile, which was as long as she allowed it, and then she wiped her face with the back of her wrist and kept walking. When she got back to the claim, Clara was sitting in the dirt outside the cabin door. Her face streaked, her doll clutched to her chest. Agnes had left her sleeping and had not returned before she woke. Clara looked up at her mother with the expression of a child who has been afraid and is now with her mother in sight, converting the fear into the relief that fear becomes when the worst thing doesn't happen. Agnes picked her up and carried her inside. She held her for a moment in the dim light of the cabin and felt the small, solid warmth of her, the particular weight of a child who has been frightened and has stopped being frightened. Then she set her down and looked at the frame in the corner, 2 pine walls, the joints rough but square, the door not yet hung. She looked at it the way she had looked at the cot in the boarding house in Chicago the morning after Thomas died, which was to say without sentiment, but with the absolute clarity of a person who has reached the end of the options that don't require them to do the hard thing. She was going to build the box. She was going to finish it and use it and find out if her grandmother had been right. And if she was wrong, if the box failed and the coal got through, and the thing Ruth Connell had said, the finding was what happened then, she was going to be wrong in the act of doing the only thing that made sense to her, not in the act of waiting for someone else's plan to work. Clara tugged at her sleeve. Agnes looked at her daughter, 4 years old, dark-eyed, wearing a dress that had already been let out once and would need to be let out again by spring if they made it to spring. Clara did not ask what they were going to do. She had stopped asking that somewhere in the 3rd week. What she asked instead was simpler and more immediate. "Are we going to eat dinner?" "Yes," Agnes said. "We're going to eat dinner." She lit the stove. She made corn mush with the meal she had bought in Parker, and fed Clara and ate herself and watched the stovepipe in the corner, the way it moved in the small wind that moved through the cabin, the way the wire at the middle joint strained slightly and then released. Outside, the August heat was a memory. October was 2 weeks away. The grass outside had gone from green to gold to something between gold and brown, and in the mornings now there was frost on the inside of the window that had to be rubbed away before the light would come through. She washed the dishes and put Clara to bed and sat in the one chair the cabin provided and read Thomas's letter one more time. Room for Clara to grow up without walls pressing in. She looked at the unfinished frame in the corner, at the space inside it that was barely enough for 2 bodies, that was walls pressing in from every direction. He had not been wrong. He had just been talking about a different kind of wall. October arrived the way a verdict arrives, not as a surprise exactly, but with the particular weight of something that had been decided long before you were ready for it. The 18th brought the first frost, and it was not the gentle frost of early autumn that melts by 10 in the morning and leaves the grass silver and beautiful in the early light. It was the kind that stayed. Agnes found it on the inside of the window when she woke, a thin film of white on the lower pane, and when she pressed her fingertip to it, the cold bit back, immediately a clean, sharp bite that told her the temperature had dropped well below freezing in the night and had not come back up by morning. The water bucket beside the stove had a skin of ice across the top, thin enough to break with a knuckle, but solid, definite of fact. She stood in the cabin in her wool socks and looked at the frost and performed the same calculation she had been performing every morning for 2 months, the one that never produced a comfortable answer. Wood behind the cabin, she had been cutting and splitting what she could find, adding to the original pile with fallen timber she dragged from a dry creek bed 3/4 of a mile south, and the pile now stood at roughly 1.25 cords, which was to say, roughly 13 cords short of what Stanton had told her she needed. The stovepipe had held through the first weeks of October, through 3 windstorms that rattled the cabin walls and sent the pipe shaking in its collar, the wire at each joint straining and holding, straining and holding. She had watched it carefully through each storm, and she could see that the wire was no longer doing the same work it had been in August. It was thinner now, or appeared thinner the way metal appears to thin when it has been repeatedly stressed, and is not far from the end of what it can do. The box was 3 days from complete. She had been building it in every hour Clara slept, and in every hour after dark when the lamp held oil and her hands could still manage a hammer. The 2 pine walls were up and solid. The door hung on its brass hinges, the fit imperfect. When she first mounted it, a gap at the top left corner wide enough to feel cold air moving through, and she had spent an entire evening with the short-handled hammer Margaret Stanton had included without being asked, tapping the top hinge pin incrementally until the door swung true and closed flush. The latch was a piece of flat iron bent at the hardware store in Parker by the owner for 15 cents when she explained what she needed. It seated into a notch she had cut in the doorframe with a chisel borrowed from the store in exchange for a promise she would return it before November. The inside of the box still needed its lining. Agnes had been saving newspapers since August, every paper that came through Parker, which was not many, and which she had collected by asking the storekeeper to set aside issues that his customers had finished reading. She had 23 pages, not enough, and she needed more. The lining was not decorative. She had worked through the physics of it on a night in late September when she could not sleep, and her mind had moved into the precise methodical gear it's sometimes found in the small hours newspaper was a poor conductor of heat, which meant it was a useful insulator when layered against a surface through which cold was trying to move. Her grandmother had lined the sleeping box in Illinois with newspaper and flour paste, and the result was walls that took longer to cool and gave back the warmth they had absorbed more slowly. It was not the same as real insulation, but it was what she had, and what she had was what she was working with. She walked to Parker on the 21st of October and asked the storekeeper outright for every back issue he had kept. He gave her a stack without charging for it, which was either generosity or the specific discomfort of a man who did not want to think about what she needed them for and why. She carried the stack back 4 miles and spent the next 2 evenings pasting pages to the interior walls of the box, with Clara helping, Clara's small hands smoothing each page flat against the wood, pressing out the bubbles, taking the task seriously with the focused attention of a 4-year-old who understands that what she is doing is important without understanding exactly why. "What's it for?" Clara asked on the second evening, pressing a page against the back wall, the flour paste glistening white in the lamplight. Agnes smoothed the edge of the page with her mere thumb. "So the cold can't get through as fast." Clara considered this with her palm flat against the newsprint, feeling it adhere. "Like a coat. Like a coat." Clara nodded, satisfied, and reached for the next page. The box was complete on the 22nd of October. Agnes stood back and looked at it in the lamplight. 6 feet by 3.5 feet by 4 feet, 2 walls of pine, and 2 walls of the original cabin, the interior lined with newspaper and paste, a door that closed and latched from inside. The straw tick mattress from her trunk lay on the floor beside, covered with the feather tick that had been her mother's, and then hers the quilts and wool blankets folded on top of it. She had concentrated everything she had into that space, every blanket, every quilt. Every piece of warm bedding that had made the journey from Chicago now lived in 84 cubic feet of pine and newsprint in the southeast corner of a 12 by 14-foot shanty on the Dakota Plain. She climbed in with Clara that first night, without ceremony, pulled the door shut behind them, latched it, and lay in the complete dark. The air inside the box was cold, the same cold as the cabin, which was not warm. Clara's small back was against her front, both of them still in their day clothes, with wool socks buried under 2 quilts and the wool blankets. Agnes lay still and waited and listened to the particular silence of a space that is not doing anything yet. 20 minutes later, she put her hand against the pine wall beside her. The wood was cool, but it was not the biting, radiating cold of the cabin air. It was the neutral cool of a surface that was neither adding cold nor losing heat rapidly, a surface that was in the careful vocabulary of her grandmother's lesson, holding something rather than releasing it. The box was working, not dramatically, not with any sensations she could have described to a skeptic, but working in the way that fundamental things work, quietly and without announcement, in the same manner that water finds level and gravity holds bodies to the earth. Their heat was not escaping. The small volume around them was warming. Clara's breathing had slowed from the shallow, quick breath of a cold child to the deeper rhythm of a child who is no longer spending energy fighting the temperature. Agnes lay awake for another hour, not from fear, but from something adjacent to astonishment. The particular astonishment of a person who has bet everything on a proposition and has just seen the first evidence that the proposition is sound. She did not allow herself to be certain. One good night was data, not proof, but it was data she had not had the night before, and she held it carefully. The 29th of October came in with a wind that had been building since noon. Agnes was in the yard twisting hay into fuel bundles, the technique she had learned from a pamphlet she'd found folded inside one of the donated newspapers, a method the homesteading guides recommended for settlers who could not afford enough wood, which was to say most of them. You twisted prairie hay tightly as tight as your hands could manage until it became dense enough to burn slowly rather than flaring and dying in minutes. It was slow work and hard on the hands, which were already in poor condition. The palms calloused in new places, the skin at every knuckle cracked and slow to heal in the dry autumn air. But a bundle of twisted hay burned for 20 minutes, and 20 minutes was 20 minutes. She heard the sound before she felt the wind shift, a metallic complaint from the direction of the cabin. High and sharp, the sound of metal moving against metal in a way it was not meant to move. She was on her feet before she finished identifying it. The stovepipe. She had known for 3 weeks it was coming, and she had spent those 3 weeks hoping it would wait. It had not waited. She pushed through the cabin door. Smoke was pouring down from the roof collar where the upper section had separated, not the middle joint as she had expected, but the topmost joint where the pipe met the collar, a gap she had been watching with less attention because she had been more worried about the middle. The fire was still alive in the stove, drawing air through the separation and throwing sparks up into the space between the detached pipe end and the tar paper collar. Tar paper was what the roof was made of. Tar paper was, in the presence of sparks, a straightforward catastrophe. Agnes pushed Clara out the door. "Stand at the fence post. Don't move." Clara went without question. Agnes went back in. She could not see clearly. The smoke was filling the upper half of the cabin from the ceiling down, and her eyes were streaming within seconds of the door closing behind her. She worked from memory and from the position of her feet, 3 steps to the stove, the water bucket to the left of the stove, the smaller bucket of snow she had started keeping inside the north wall for exactly this kind of emergency. Though she had imagined this emergency differently, imagined it at night, imagined having more time. She grabbed the snow bucket and threw it at the firebox, heard the hiss and fight of fire, meeting cold wet, threw the water bucket next, got down below the smoke line and crawled to the stove, and packed snow from the drift that had built against the inside base of the north wall into the firebox with her bare hands until the last coal went dark and the draft stopped pulling air through the separation. The sparks had stopped. The roof had not caught. She climbed outside and stood in the wind, her hands red and her eyes streaming and her lungs burning from the smoke, and looked up at the hole where the upper pipe section had been. It was gone, not merely separated, but taken by the wind, which had been building all afternoon and was now strong enough that she could feel it trying to lift the back hem of her skirt. The remaining sections were still in place, but without the top section, there was an open hole in the roof collar, and through that hole the wind was now pouring directly into the cabin. She looked at Clara standing at the fence post with her doll watching. "Mama fixed it," Clara said with the confidence of someone who has accumulated enough evidence for a conclusion. "Not yet," Agnes said. She got the ladder 2 planks of scrap wood and with notches cut in them barely adequate and climbed onto the roof with a fistful of wire and a wad of clay from the creek bank she had started keeping in a tin bucket against the north wall of the cabin. On the roof the wind was personal. It came from the northwest with the specific intention, it seemed, of making the task she was attempting impossible. She lay flat against the tar paper and worked by feel, her face turned sideways against the roof, her fingers finding the collar, finding the remaining pipe section, shoving it up into the collar and feeling it seat crooked, not straight, but seated. She wrapped wire around the joint where it met the collar. 3 loops pulled tight enough that the wire cut into her palm. She pressed clay around the outside of the joint, packing it into the gap with her thumb, working it in section because the wind was trying to take it before it could set. She climbed down. The repair would hold, or it would not. She had done what she could do with what she had to do it with, which was the only category of action available to her. Standing in the yard, shaking from the cold and the effort and the adrenaline leaving her system, she understood something that she had understood intellectually for weeks, but now understood in her body in the specific way that knowledge becomes different. When the body has participated in it, the stovepipe was not going to survive the winter. It was going to fail because the structure itself was past the point where repairs could address the underlying condition. It was held together by will and wire and the absence of a wind strong enough to finish what the October winds had started. That wind was coming. Every person she had spoken to since August had told her that January and February were different from what had come before, that what had come before was the opening act, that the main thing was still ahead. The box was not optional. She had been building it as a precaution, as the intelligent response to a risk she understood, but had not let herself fully confront. She stopped treating it as a precaution that night. Earl Stanton arrived on the 3rd of November with a wagon loaded with split wood. He pulled up to the cabin without advance notice, tied the horse to the fence post that had not yet fallen, and began unloading without introduction or explanation. Agnes came outside and watched him work for a moment before speaking. "I can't pay for that. I got 2 laying hens." He set down an armload and went back for another. "I need laying hens. You need wood. 1 cord for 2 hens." She knew the math. A cord of split hardwood in Dakota Territory in November ran $2 on a fair day. 2 hens were worth 50 cents if the buyer was feeling generous. She also knew that a man who had watched his family die of cold in 1881 would not accept charity from a widow on a failed homestead, and that what he was offering her was the same transaction she had offered herself when she had decided to stay away to do the necessary thing without having to name it as anything other than practical. She got the hens. While he stacked the wood against the cabin's north wall, Stanton walked inside for a moment and came back out without explanation. She had not invited him in and had not stopped him. He stood in the yard and looked at the repaired stovepipe, at the clay packing visible around the collar joint, even from the ground. "That will not hold a hard blow." "I know." He looked at her the way he had looked at the woodpile on his first visit, measuring, accounting, arriving at a number. "You built that box." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the space between them without filling it with anything useful. "My mother had something like it. When I was young, Indiana." He said it as if it had just occurred to him, as if a door in a room he had not entered in decades had come open an inch, and he was not sure yet what to do about it. "I hadn't thought of it. When Miriam and the children—" He stopped. The sentence did not continue. It did not need to. "I hadn't thought of it in years. Maybe I'd decided it was old-fashioned, something for a different time." His jaw moved slightly. "Maybe I was wrong about that." Agnes said nothing. There was nothing to add. He had said a thing that had cost him something to say, and the correct response was to let it be what it was, without attaching anything to it. He climbed back onto the wagon. He had not said the box would work. He had not said she had been right. He had said his mother had something like it, and he had said maybe he had been wrong to forget it, and that was from Earl Stanton a form of acknowledgement that Agnes understood was as close to concession as the man was built to offer. "If you survive the winter," he said, picking up the reins, "I'll say I was wrong, out loud, to whoever's standing nearby." He looked at her once more. "I hope I get to say it." He drove north. Agnes stood in the cold and watched him go, and then went inside and started dinner. Because dinner was what came next, and what came next was what she did. November settled in cold and stayed. The temperature dropped through the month in irregular increments, a mild week followed by a week of hard frost, then mild again, then colder, then cold enough that the water bucket froze solid overnight and had to be thawed every morning by setting it directly on the stove before the fire had a chance to build properly. Agnes tracked the temperature on a small thermometer she had bought for 30 cents in Parker and hung on the nail above the door. The lowest it had read by the end of November was 12 below zero. She noted it and kept working. She and Clara slept in the box every night. The routine of it became ordinary, the latching of the door, the arrangement of the blankets in the specific order that worked best the first 20 minutes of adjustment as the space moved from the cold of the cabin to the accumulated warmth of their bodies. Clara had stopped treating it as unusual. She climbed in the way she climbed into any bed, with the practiced ease of familiarity, pulling her doll in after her settling against her mother's front with the unconscious trust of a child who has decided that the arrangement is reliable. On a night in early December, Agnes woke at 3 in the morning and lay still in the dark and took stock. The cabin temperature outside the box was somewhere near zero, she estimated. She could feel the cold on her face and in her breath and in the specific quality of the silence, which at extreme temperatures had a density to it, a thickness that ordinary cold did not produce. The water bucket was frozen through as it had been every night for 2 weeks. Inside the box, inside the blankets, inside the accumulated warmth of 2 people in 84 cubic feet of enclosed space. She was warm. Not comfortable in the way of a heated room, not warm the way a summer afternoon is warm. Warm in the specific way of something that is generating exactly enough heat to sustain itself. Her feet were warm, her back was warm. The arm she had around Clara was warm. Her nose was cold, and the air she breathed into her lungs was cold. But the cold in the air she breathed was different from the cold that killed. It was ambient, not aggressive, the cold of a space that had been partially conquered rather than the cold of a space that was winning. She had stopped stoking the fire past midnight. She let it burn down to embers at 10 or 11, filled the stove with what wood she had calculated for the night, and climbed into the box and left the rest to physics. Every morning she woke and pushed open the door and stepped out into the frozen cabin, and the frozen air hit her face like a reprimand. And every morning she was there to receive it. Something had changed in that December night that she would not have been able to name precisely if asked. She had stopped asking whether the box would work and had started asking only what she still needed to prepare. That shift from doubt to logistics was the difference between a person surviving a situation and a person waiting to find out if they would. She did not mark the moment. She simply woke up one morning and noticed it had already happened. Ruth Connell came by in the third week of December, ostensibly to bring a half-dozen sweet potatoes from a cache she was worried would freeze in her own root cellar. She came inside and stood in the cabin and looked at the thermometer on the nail above the door. The mercury sat at 8 degrees above zero. Ruth looked at the thermometer. She looked at Agnes. "It says 8 degrees in here and you're standing in your shirt sleeves." "I just came in from outside. 8 degrees feels warm." Ruth set the sweet potatoes on the plank table. She looked at the box one more time, not the inspection of a skeptic, but the look of a person trying to understand something they have not understood yet. "We haven't had a real blow yet. 40 below, Agnes. What you're feeling now is the warm part of winter." "I know." "Then you know this hasn't been tested." "Not yet." She left without elaborating. Which Agnes had come to understand was Ruth Connell's particular way of continuing a conversation by leaving it open rather than closing it with a verdict. Stanton appeared at the cabin on a morning in early January to check the stovepipe, which he claimed he was doing because he was checking all his neighbors' pipes, which may have been true. He looked at the clay packing around the collar joint and touched it with one finger and turned to Agnes with the expression he wore when the facts were not in dispute. "It'll go in the first real wind." "Yes. January is when it gets serious. February too. Do not." His voice dropped to the register he used when he was saying something he intended to be remembered. "Do not let your guard down because it's held this long." He left satisfied or not. It was hard to tell with Stanton, which was a quality Agnes had come to respect in him. He did not perform reassurance. He gave you what he had and left you to do what you were going to do with it. On the 10th of January, she was in the Parker store buying salt and a small amount of cornmeal. Wallace Pruitt was there, had been there when she arrived, talking to the storekeeper about seed prices, the kind of conversation that could fill a winter afternoon because it did not need to go anywhere. He let Agnes complete her business at the counter before he said anything. He waited until she had paid and was turning toward the door. "She won't make March." He addressed the storekeeper, not Agnes. The two other men in the store became very interested in what they were looking at. "First real blizzard finishes it. That stovepipe is visible from the road, and it's been one bad gust away from gone since October. I've said it before." He paused, letting the silence fill with what he wasn't saying, which was the part about the child. He had learned from the first time not to say the part about the child directly, because that had not produced the effect he intended. He was a man who adjusted his methods. Some things you can't fix by building a box around them. Agnes was already at the door. She did not stop. She did not turn around. The cold outside hit her face and she walked south and did not think about Pruitt for the remainder of the 4-mile walk because she had more pressing things to occupy the space in her mind where she might have put him. The 11th of January arrived warm. Not Illinois in October warm, not anything that would register as warm in any other context, but warm for Dakota in January above freezing by mid-morning, the packed snow on the cabin roof beginning to drip from the south eave. The air had that quality she had noticed once before in early November, before a 3-day cold snap, the soft quality, the quality of an exhale. She was outside when she noticed it, and she noticed that the feeling it produced in her was not relief but alertness. She walked to the stovepipe and examined the collar joint. Two of the three joints in the pipe were loose. She could feel it by pressing lightly. The sections shifted under almost no pressure. The wire at the middle joint frayed down to perhaps a quarter of its original gauge. The clay packing at the collar crumbled at the edges where freeze and thaw had worked at it through the winter. She pressed the collar joint once firmly and felt it move 3/4 of an inch and not come back to where it had been. She went inside. She brought an extra quilt from the trunk she had not used since September into the box and arranged it with the others. She placed the water bucket just inside the box door where she could reach it without going far. She put the remaining half of the bread loaf in the jar of lard in a position she could reach quickly and without light. Then she spoke to Clara, who was on the floor with her doll, who looked up with the direct attention she gave to things that mattered. Tomorrow, if I say go to the box, you go right then. You don't ask why. You go and you take your doll and you wait for me. Clara looked at her for a moment with the specific seriousness of a child who has learned to distinguish between the things her mother says that are ordinary and the things her mother says that are load-bearing. Okay. That night, Agnes lay awake in the box listening to the stovepipe. The wind had come up after sunset and was moving through from the northwest, not the hard driving wind of a real storm, but the advance edge of something, the outer atmosphere of something larger that was still some distance away, but closing. The pipe shook in a rhythm that was almost regular, almost like breathing. She listened to it and thought about the morning and about Clara's face when she had said okay in that particular way, the way of a child who understood more than she was supposed to understand, and had decided to simply do the thing that was asked because the person asking was the person whose judgment she trusted absolutely. There was no arithmetic for that. There was no version of the calculation that could hold it. Agnes pressed her hand against the pine wall of the box. The wood was warm, not the warmth of a heated surface, but the absorbed warmth of a material that had been holding heat for more than 80 nights and had learned how. She listened to the pipe, and she waited for the morning, and she thought about her grandmother in a farmhouse outside Springfield in the winter of 1863, doing something not so different in a corner. Not so different, and about what it meant that the knowing could travel that way, not written down, not in any book she had ever seen, just passed from one person's hands to another's, in the specific way that knowledge travels when it is practical enough to keep. The morning of the 12th came it above freezing. The sky was clear, and the sun came up over the eastern horizon and threw long winter shadows across the snow. Agnes went outside and hung the laundry she had not gotten to the day before. Clara played in the muddy patches where the snow had thinned along the south side of the cabin, cheerful in the unexpected warmth, making small roads in the mud with a stick for her doll to travel. Agnes looked northwest. The horizon had been straight when she first came out. It was not straight anymore. A dark line had appeared where the sky met the land, and the line was not a cloud formation, not the irregular shapes that weather systems made when they were still weather, and not yet something else. It was a wall, a solid wall moving across the prairie toward her at a speed she could measure by looking away and looking back, because each time she looked back, it was closer than it had been closer in the way that things are close when they are moving toward you, faster than you have a framework for. She could see the interior of it now. The snow moving horizontal inside it, not falling, but driven sideways at a speed that made the individual flakes invisible, just white moving at the speed of something that does not stop. The darkness at the core of it was the darkness of a thing that has gathered everything to itself. She did not raise her voice. Raising her voice would have taken a second she did not have. Clara. A calm level, the voice she had trained herself to use. Come inside now. Clara looked up from her mud roads with the expression of a child about to explain why she wasn't finished yet. Then she looked at her mother's face. She stood up. She picked up her doll. She walked to the door. Behind them, as they crossed the threshold, the sound arrived ahead of the wind itself, traveling faster than the wind could move, the sound of something very large that had been moving for a long time across a flat, empty country with nothing to stop it, and had now arrived at the place where they were standing and had no intention of stopping here either. Agnes pulled the door shut. The storm hit the cabin like a physical blow. The structure moved beneath her feet, the whole 12 by 14-foot box of boards, and tar paper flexing against the force of something that had crossed 500 miles of open country without meeting anything worth slowing down for, and had arrived here with everything it had started with and nothing spent. The walls bowed inward on the west side. The single window rattled in its frame with a frequency that was less a sound than a sensation, something Agnes felt in her back teeth rather than heard. The stove, still warm from the morning fire, ticked and contracted as the temperature inside the cabin began its rapid descent. Agnes stood in the middle of the cabin floor and felt the cold arriving. Not arriving the way a presence arrives, filling the space rather than moving through it. The wind found the gaps between the boards and poured through them, cold air under pressure pooling at the floor, the way cold air pools when there is nowhere lower for it to go. She could feel it against her ankles through her wool socks. The temperature was dropping fast enough to measure by the minute. She looked at the stovepipe. The collar joint had been moving 3/4 of an inch under light pressure the day before. Under what was hitting the cabin now, it was moving continuously, shaking in its collar. With each gust, the remaining wire at the middle joint vibrating in a register just below what the ear could fully process. She watched it the way you watch a thing you have been watching for months finally become the thing you knew it was going to become. The joint at the collar pulled, settled, pulled further, settled less completely. She had perhaps 2 minutes, perhaps less. Clara, the same voice she had used in the yard, the level voice that carried information without carrying panic, because panic in a 4-year-old produced paralysis, and she needed the opposite of paralysis. Go to the box now, take your doll, latch the door and wait for me. Clara was already moving before the sentence was complete. She had heard that voice the day before, and had been told what it meant, and she had believed the telling. She crossed the cabin in her small, quick steps, pulled open the box door, went inside, and the door swung shut behind her. Agnes heard the latch click into place from the inside. She turned back to the stovepipe. The fire was still burning. It had been burning since 7 that morning. Under these circumstances, the draft being stolen by the wind, streaming down from the northwest, the pipe shaking in its collar, the cold air pouring through the walls faster than the fire could replace it, the fire was becoming a liability rather than an asset. If the pipe separated while the fire was burning at full draw, sparks would exit the top of the stove directly into the cabin. Tar paper above, dry boards around. The fire that had been keeping them alive since August would become the thing that killed them in January, which was the kind of mathematics that the prairie offered without apology. Agnes made the decision in the time it took to make it. She moved to the stove. She pulled the snow bucket from the north wall she had maintained, the habit through the winter, keeping a bucket of packed snow inside the cabin near the base of the north wall where it stayed frozen and accessible, and she threw it at the firebox in one motion. The fire fought back. She packed more snow from the drift that had built along the base of the north wall, where the gaps between boards were widest. The drift was 3 inches high now. Inside the cabin, a fact she had been noting every morning for 2 weeks, and pressed it into the firebox with her hands, until the last coal went gray, and the last thread of smoke curled up and thinned to nothing. The pipe separated. She heard it go in the moment after the fire died, the metallic shriek of the collar joint pulling free, the rush of wind down through the open hole in the roof, the sound of the upper pipe section departing into the storm, which was not a crash but a disappearance. The pipe there and then simply gone, taken before it could make the sound of landing. Wind poured through the hole in the roof and hit the dead stove and billowed it out into the cabin in both directions. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in what felt like seconds. Agnes crossed 10 feet of frozen floor in 3 steps and put her hand on the box door and went inside and pulled it shut behind her and pushed the latch home in the dark. The darkness was absolute, not the partial darkness of a room with a window at night where shapes eventually resolve as the eye adjusts. The box had no window. With the door latched and the lamp outside on the plank table, the interior was the complete absence of light, the kind of dark that does not improve. Agnes could feel Clara against her side, small and present, and shaking with the shallow, rapid trembling of a cold child. And she could hear her breathing, and she could hear the storm outside the box and outside the cabin, and she could not see any of these things, but she knew where each of them was. "Mama's here." Clara's trembling did not stop, but it changed register slightly, the trembling of cold mixed with the trembling of relief rather than the trembling of cold alone. Agnes arranged the blankets by feel by the memory of her hands, which had arranged these same blankets in the same space for more than 80 nights. The straw tick mattress beneath them, the feather tick above that, the wool blankets. The quilts, the heavier one last pulled over both their heads and tucked at the edges under their bodies to seal the perimeter against the air that was in the box with them, which was cabin air, which was cold. Cold, in the way the cabin was cold, which was colder than it had been even the worst nights of December, because the hole in the roof had been open for the last 3 minutes and would be open until the storm ended or until the snow packed it from outside, whichever came first. The fire went out. Clara's voice came from the dark, just below Agnes's chin. Yes. What do we do now? We stay in the box. We stay warm. We wait. The logic of it was simple enough that a 4-year-old could hold it and trust it, which was why Agnes had stated it in exactly those terms. We stay in the box. We stay warm. We wait. 3 things, all of them doable, none of them requiring anything they did not have. She did not say the cabin outside this box is open to a storm that is currently killing people within it, people who are walking from their houses to their barns and losing the rope they tied between the two and dying 10 feet from their own doors. She did not say the temperature outside is dropping toward numbers that the thermometer on the nail above the door was not built to measure. She did not say any of the true things that would not help, and she said the 3 true things that would. The cold pressed against the outside of the box. She could feel it working. Not a dramatic assault, nothing so simple as that. It was the patient incremental pressure of a temperature differential, doing what temperature differentials do, moving from where there was more of it toward where there was less through the pine walls, through the newspaper lining, through the small remaining gaps between the boards she had cut and fitted and nailed in September with blistered hands and a borrowed saw. The cold was doing its job with complete indifference to the fact that there were 2 people on the other side of those boards who needed it not to succeed. 20 minutes in, Agnes put her palm flat against the wall beside her. The wood was cool, not cold. Cool in the way of a surface that is under pressure from one side and insulated on the other. The pressure was there. The cold was there, but it had not arrived. The newspaper lining was doing what she had pasted it there to do. The small volume of air around them was not the same air it had been when they climbed in. It was warmer, their bodies having replaced what the initial cold had taken, the 84 cubic feet, giving back to them the heat they were producing rather than losing it immediately to the 1,000 cubic feet beyond the door. Clara's shivering eased. It happened gradually over the span of another 10 minutes, the tight, rapid trembling, slowing to something more intermittent, then becoming the occasional small shudder of a body that is cold, but no longer losing ground to the cold. Her breathing deepened. Agnes felt the change in the weight of her, the specific way a child's body changes when the crisis has passed enough that the body stops bracing against it and begins to rest. Clara pressed closer, not from fear, but from comfort, the instinctive seeking of warmth that is as old as any human thing. It's getting warm, Clara said with the straightforward satisfaction of someone reporting a fact. It is. The box is working. Agnes pulled the quilt tighter over them both, tucking the edge under her hip where a gap had opened. The box is working. Outside, beyond the pine walls of the box and beyond the board walls of the cabin, the storm was doing what the January storm of 1888 was doing across 600 miles of Dakota and Minnesota and Nebraska, collapsing everything that was not built to survive. Everything that had been built to an adequate standard for ordinary winters and had not been built for this. The sound of it came through both sets of walls as something between a roar and a scream, a sound so continuous and so large that after the first hour, Agnes's mind stopped registering it as a sound and started registering it as a condition, the way you stop hearing a river after you have camped beside it long enough. She did not sleep. She was not afraid. Exactly, fear required uncertainty, and she had moved past uncertainty. Somewhere in the first hour, when the temperature inside the blankets had stabilized and Clara had stopped shivering. What she had instead of fear was attention, the complete and focused attention of a person who has one job and is doing it. The job was to keep the heat in and stay awake enough to know if something changed. She shifted every 40 minutes or so, adjusting the blankets where they had loosened, repositioning Clara, who slept deeply and with the complete physical commitment of a child who has decided that the present situation is safe enough for sleep. Each time Agnes moved, She pressed her hand briefly to the wall, taking the temperature the way a doctor takes a pulse reading, not the number, but the trend. Sometime around midnight, she heard a crash that was close enough and large enough to be the cabin. She went rigid. She wrapped both arms around Clara and held still and waited for the walls of the box to open for the cold to pour through as the structure around them gave way. She counted seconds. The walls did not open. The box held its position in its corner, the two existing cabin walls that formed its back and side still present, still standing. Whatever had broken was not the cabin. She exhaled and relaxed her grip on Clara, who had not woken. She would learn later that it was the Connell's chicken coop lifted from its foundation by the wind and thrown 100 yards southeast into the open field, where it came apart on contact with the frozen ground and distributed itself across a quarter-mile of prairie. She would learn that Daniel Connell had tried to reach the chickens when the storm first hit and had made it back to the house missing sensation in 2 fingers, which never fully came back. She would learn that the Connells had spent the night in their cabin, which was better built than hers but still cold enough by morning, that the water bucket beside their stove froze solid before dawn. In the box, the temperature held. This was the fact that Agnes returned to each time she felt the cold pressing harder through the walls. Not that the cold was not there, not that the storm was not as bad as everyone had said it would be, but that the temperature inside the blankets was not dropping in a way that tracked with what was happening outside. The cold was working at the boundary. The boundary was holding. Not easily, not without cost, she could feel the temperature of the air she breathed, falling slowly through the night as the box gave up heat. It could not replace fast enough, and their bodies worked to make up the difference. But the rate of loss was slow enough. The rate of production was enough. The math held. At some point in what she estimated was the second hour after midnight, Clara woke in the dark. She didn't cry. She didn't call out. She said in the quiet, factual voice of a child who has just returned from sleep to wakefulness and is taking stock. "Mama, are we dying?" 1 second, 2 seconds. The storm screaming outside the box, holding the heat present in the blankets between them. Indisputable, measurable by any hand pressed to any surface in any direction. "No, we're in the box." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay," and she went back to sleep. Agnes lay in the dark and held her daughter and waited for the morning. And the morning came the way mornings come after the worst nights, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but as a gradual reduction in what the dark was doing, a lightning that was not light yet, but was the beginning of the direction light came from. She heard the wind diminish in stages over the span of an hour, the roar losing its top register, the constant pressure against the walls easing, the sound returning to something that could be classified as wind rather than force. By the time she judged it to be fully light outside, the storm had not stopped, but had moved on, had spent what it had to spend here, and continued east toward Minnesota, toward Wisconsin, toward all the places that did not yet know what was coming. She pushed back the quilts and reached for the box door. The latch was cold against her fingers, not the cold of something slightly chilled, but the cold of metal that has spent 18 hours adjacent to air, that had been working hard to reach temperatures well below what the thermometer on the nail could record. She pressed it, and the door swung open, and the air hit her face with the specific brutality of extreme cold meeting. Warm skin, a shock that was almost tactile, almost a pressure rather than a temperature. She stepped out into the cabin. The frost was on everything. The walls, the floor, the stove, the plank table, the chair, the shelf with the tin cup and the cracked plate. The nail heads on the west wall were white. The inside of the window, buried in snow from outside, was sheeted with ice an inch thick, the glass invisible behind it. Her breath came out in a cloud so thick it hung in the air for a full second before dispersing. She crossed to the thermometer and looked at it and saw what she had expected to see: the mercury at the base of the scale below the lowest printed number, which was 30 below zero. She looked at the stovepipe hole in the roof, packed solid with snow. The cabin had been open to the sky for 18 hours, which meant the cabin had been for all practical purposes outside. There was a drift against the north wall and inside the cabin that had not been there 2 days ago. The door was blocked from outside. She could tell by the resistance when she pushed it and by the light that came through the gap at the top, a 6-inch gap, the rest solid with packed snow. She was not getting out that way without help. She went back to the box and climbed in and pulled the door shut. They stayed in the box through the first day, leaving only in short intervals, Agnes alone, 15 or 20 seconds at a time to accomplish what needed to be accomplished and return before the cold could follow her back. She chipped ice from the water bucket with the latch handle and let it melt against her palm for drinking water. She retrieved the bread and lard from the shelf she had staged them on in her last act of preparation 2 days ago. Each excursion into the cabin was a lesson in what the temperature would have done to them. Without the box, her fingers went numb in under 30 seconds, the cold in her lungs with each breath producing a sensation that was less like breathing cold air and more like breathing something with edges to it. Clara stayed in the box without being told to. She understood the geography of the situation with the pragmatic intelligence of a child who has been paying attention all winter to the difference between where her mother said was safe and where her mother said was not. She ate bread and lard and did not complain about it. She talked to her doll. She slept again in the afternoon, and while she slept, Agnes sat upright in the box with the door cracked an inch and listened to the silence that had replaced the storm, which was not an absence of sound, but a different kind of sound. The crystalline silence of extreme cold, the silence of a world that has been simplified to its essential components. The second day passed the same way. Agnes heard voices outside in the afternoon. Distant shouted words, the creak in protest of a wagon moving through deep snow. She tried to call out through the buried window, but her voice, hoarsened from the soak of 2 days ago, did not carry through the snow-packed walls. She heard the sounds move away and could not tell if they had stopped at her claim or past it. She would learn later that they had stopped. That Stanton had spent 2 days working outward from his own farm in a systematic pattern, checking every claim he knew within 4 miles, and that hers had been on his route, but that the snow had blocked the door and the window, and the sound she had made had not reached him on that first pass, and he had moved on and come back. On the afternoon of the second day, someone began digging at the door. She heard it as a muffled, rhythmic impact, then as a scraping, then as the specific sound of a shovel working against packed snow, in the particular way that means the person doing the working knows what they are doing and intends to complete it. She moved to the door of the cabin and stood back from it and waited. The gap at the top of the door widened. Light came through. Cold air came through. Then the door swung inward, and the full cold of the outside entered all at once, and in the doorway, frost in his beard and his eyes red from wind and cold, stood Earl Stanton. He looked at her. She was standing in the middle of the cabin in her dress and shawl, her breath a cloud, her hair loose, her hands wrapped in the cloth she had been wearing on them since the fire went out. Behind her, the dead stove, the frost on every surface, the thermometer at its lowest mark, the drift inside along the north wall, the hole in the roof where the stovepipe had been packed with snow, the lamp on the table with no oil left in it. He took all of it in without moving in the way of a man who has been trained by experience to read a scene before he enters it. He looked at the stove. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the pipe hole in the roof. He looked at the box in the corner, the door standing open, the quilts inside still holding the compressed shape of 2 people who had been sleeping in them until recently. He walked to the box. He put his hand flat against the pine wall the way he had put his hand against the wall on the 3rd of November when he brought the cord of wood. He held it there for 3 seconds. He pulled it back and looked at it and looked at Agnes. It's warm. Body heat. She kept her voice level. She had not spoken to another adult in 2 days, and her voice sounded strange to her, rougher than she remembered it being. 2 people in a small space. The walls hold what the bodies make. He looked at the box for a long time. Not the skeptic's examination he had given it in November, the measuring look of a man assessing a claim he doubted. Something different. The look of a man revising something, the specific cognitive work of a person who held a position for a long time and is now in the presence of evidence he cannot dispute, setting it down. The fire's been out. It was not a question, but it was looking for confirmation. Since the storm hit, the pipe went inside the first hour. That was 2 days ago. He looked at the thermometer again, at the drift on the floor, at the frost on the stovepipe collar where the pipe used to be. 30, 40 below, both nights. I don't know the exact number. The thermometer doesn't go that low. He was quiet for a moment. Clara appeared in the box doorway, wrapped in a quilt, her doll under her arm, and looked at Stanton with the frank assessment of a 4-year-old taking stock of a visitor. You stayed warm in there, He addressed this to Clara directly, which was not what Agnes expected. Both nights, Clara held up two fingers. Mama kept me warm. The box kept the cold out. Stanton turned away. He stood facing the frost-covered west wall with his back to both of them, his shoulders tight against whatever he was working through, his breath coming out in regular clouds. When he turned back, his face had completed whatever process it had been in the middle of. I told you that child would freeze in her bed. Each word came out with the weight of something being put down rather than thrown. I told you to your face. I was wrong. The box works. I'm glad you're alive to prove it. He looked at Clara one more time. I'm glad she is too. He went outside and came back with boards from the section of Agnes's chicken coop that the storm had torn loose and deposited against the north side of the cabin. The structure had not survived the storm, two of the four walls having given way, but the boards were there and they were usable. He nailed them over the pipe hole in the roof, working from the outside, and the sound of his hammer was the first ordinary sound Agnes had heard since the storm hit, a sound so mundane and so functional that she stood in the cabin and listened to it with a feeling she could not have named precisely, but that was somewhere in the neighborhood of the feeling of being returned to the world after an absence. He left half a cord of wood from his own diminished supply, enough to get the stove running again and the cabin temperature back to something a body could tolerate moving through. Before he climbed onto his wagon, he stood in the yard and looked at the cabin for a moment, at the partition roof, at the window, still half buried in snow, at the structure that had offered its occupants so little and had somehow been enough because of what they had put inside it. Teach the others, he said. Show them how to build it. Dimensions, placement, everything. We need to know this. Agnes said she would. He drove north. She started the fire. Word moved across the settlement the way word moved in places where the distances between people were large and the events worth discussing were few, not quickly in the sense of hours, but with the specific efficiency of information that people needed and recognized as needing. By the end of the first week after the storm, 3 families had come to see the box. They came on horseback when the roads were passable and on foot when they were not. And Agnes showed each of them the same things in the same order, the dimensions written on a scrap of paper she kept on the shelf for this purpose: 6 feet by 3.5 feet by 4 feet. The placement in the corner, the use of existing walls as 2 sides of the structure. The newspaper lining and the flour paste and the reason for both. The importance of the door fitting flush of the latch working from inside of the bedding, being concentrated rather than distributed. She did not charge. She did not perform. She showed them what she had built and explained what it had done on the night of January 12th and let them make their own determinations. Earl Stanton told the story of finding them at every gathering of settlers where the winter of 1888 came up, which was every gathering of settlers for the next 20 years, because the winter of 1888 was the kind of event that reshapes a community's understanding of what it means to be where they were. He told it the same way each time he had gone to the whole cabin, expecting to retrieve bodies. He had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had been unambiguous. Fire out pipe, gone 40 below 2 days. There was only one answer to those numbers. He had dug out the door and pushed it open, and Agnes Holt had been standing in the middle of that frozen room in her dress and shawl, and she had looked at him, as he always said at the end of the telling, like he was the one who needed to be asked how he had managed. He had been wrong about the box. He said this every time at the beginning of the story, before he got to the part about the digging, so that no one listening would miss it. He had looked at the thing she was building, and he had known what the winter was, and he had believed that knowing what the winter was meant, he knew what would happen, and he had been wrong. The box worked. The small space held the heat the large space could not hold. The knowledge that a widow from Illinois carried in her memory had been correct, and his certainty had been incorrect, and 2 people were alive because she had trusted the knowledge over the certainty. He said at the end of every telling, I hope every one of you has a box. I hope none of you ever needs it the way she needed it. But if you need it, I hope it holds. Because I watched her walk out of that cabin after 2 days at 40 below without a fire, and there are things you see that you do not forget, and that is one of them. Ruth Connell came on the 20th of January. Daniel was with her. His right hand bandaged, the index and middle fingers gone to frostbite when he had tried to reach the chickens in the early minutes of the storm before the full weight of it was apparent. He had made it back to the house. The chickens had not made it anywhere. Ruth walked around the box the way she had walked around the unfinished frame in October, running her hand along the boards. But the quality of the examination was entirely different. Not the inspection of a skeptic looking for the flaw in the argument, but the investigation of someone who intends to build one and is determining how. I told you this was gambling your daughter's life on something you remembered from childhood. Ruth's voice was even without the self-punishment that confession sometimes carries, and without the false brightness of someone trying to minimize what they said. I was wrong. The memory was right. You were right. I was wrong. She looked at Daniel. I want one. Before February is done, I'm not spending another night in a winter like that one without a box to go to if the fire goes. Daniel was already measuring with the length of string he had thought to bring the bandaged hand managing the string with the careful compensation of someone learning a new range of motion. By February, the Connells had a box in their cabin. By the end of February, two other families in the settlement had built them one using Ruth as the instructor, rather than Agnes, the method already propagating, without Agnes needing to be the point of origin for each iteration. By the following winter, the number had doubled. The dimensions varied slightly. A family with 4 children built theirs longer 6.5 feet. A family with a very small cabin modified the height to 3.5 feet to accommodate the lower ceiling, but the principle remained intact across every variation. Small space, existing walls where possible, door that latched from inside, everything warm you owned concentrated. Wallace Pruitt did not visit. Agnes saw him at the Parker store in late February when she came in for salt and dry beans, and their eyes met across the length of the room, and he turned back to his conversation with the storekeeper without acknowledgement. She had heard by then what the storm had cost him: 2 horses, good breeding stock, spooked out of the barn in the first hour and dead in the field by morning. The loss was larger in dollar terms than anything she had on her whole claim. She stood at the counter and waited for the storekeeper to fill her order and thought about what that information meant to her, and the answer she arrived at was nothing useful. Pruitt had not cost her anything by being wrong about her, and his being wrong about her had not cost him his horses, and the connection between his opinion and her survival was not causal in any direction she could follow to a useful conclusion. She paid for her salt and her beans and walked home. The settlers stopped calling it Agnes's box after a while, then stopped calling it anything particular at all. It became part of how the thing was done, passed along with the other knowledge of how to survive in a place that required specific knowledge to survive, in the way you twisted hay, the way you banked a fire, the way you watched the northwest horizon in January, and understood what a straight, dark line along it meant before it became a wall. The box joined that body of knowledge and lost its origin story, the way useful things often lose their origin stories by being used until the using of them becomes unremarkable. She proved up the claim in the spring of 1892. 5 years after Thomas Holt had filed the papers, and 8 months after he had mailed a letter from Parker Station describing 160 acres of black soil and big sky and room for a child to grow. The county clerk was a young man who had not been in Turner County in 1888 and who processed her paperwork with the efficient disinterest of someone doing a routine task. He confirmed the acreage, confirmed the residency period, confirmed the improvements she had made, the additional room built in 1890, the proper well dug in 1891, the root cellar, and asked her to sign 3 places. She signed. On the walk back from the county office, she passed the claim milepost that had Thomas's name carved into it, put there by Thomas before he went back to Chicago, and died in a boarding house before he could return. She had walked past it hundreds of times in 5 years. She touched it briefly as she passed it, the way you touch something you have incorporated into your daily geography so completely that the touching is no longer a gesture but a habit. Clara grew. This is the simplest way to say a complicated thing that took years. She grew the way children grow in places that ask things of them, not into softness, but into a kind of competence that was indistinguishable from confidence. The confidence of someone who has learned early that the ground is real, and the cold is real, and the things that protect you are things you build and maintain. By the time she was 10, she could twist hay as fast as Agnes. By 12, she was better with the hammer, having had the advantage of learning with both hands still intact and the luxury of practice without emergency. Agnes expanded the cabin in 1894, adding a proper sleeping room off the east wall with a real bed frame and a cornhusk mattress, and a window that faced south and let in the afternoon sun. The carpenter who built it asked about the box in the main room's corner, and she explained it, and he nodded and said he had heard about them, and she said what she had been saying to everyone who asked since the winter of 1888, "The box holds your heat, the room loses it, stay in the box." In 1899, a mason from Sioux Falls came to build the new chimney and install the cooking stove with the proper ceramic flue liner and the iron damper and the draft that had no relationship to wire or clay or desperation. He was good at his work and finished in 3 days and looked at the box still standing in the corner of what was now the sitting room and offered to take it out to give her more space. The pine boards had gone from the pale weathered gray of new wood to the deep brown black of boards that have been in a heated space for 12 years, the color of things that have absorbed what the years put into them. Agnes told him to leave it. He noted it in his records as existing furniture and said nothing further. She slept in the box every winter night for the rest of her life. This was not sentiment or not only sentiment. It was the position of someone who had tested a thing under the most extreme conditions available and had found it reliable and who saw no reason to abandon a reliable thing for a more comfortable thing that had not been tested in the same way. The bedroom with the corn husk mattress and the south-facing window was where she rested in summer, was where she napped in fall, was where she lay sick with the influenza that came through Turner County in the last weeks of February 1923 and did not let go. But when December came each year, Agnes Holt moved the quilts into the box and closed the door at night and woke in the morning still warm, and that was how she knew winter had arrived and that she was prepared to meet it. Clara was at her bedside in the first week of March 1923, 39 years old, her own daughter in the next room where the south light came in the afternoons. The influenza that took Agnes Holt took her the way things take people who have spent 35 years meeting the hardest things their world offered and have arrived at their late 60s with the specific exhaustion of a person who has used themselves fully. Not violently, not fighting. She died in the way of a woman who had decided that the things she needed to do had been done and that what remained was to rest. The box stood in the corner of the sitting room as it had stood since October of 1887. 36 years of winters had done to it what winters do to well-built things left in place, not deteriorating but deepening the pine boards darker, the joints settled into themselves, the door swinging on its original hinges, with the specific reliability of a mechanism that has been used correctly and maintained and trusted. Clara ran her hand along the wall of the box after her mother was gone, the way her mother had run her hand along it on the first night reading the temperature through the palm. The wood was warm, not from the stove which had been burning at low heat for days during the illness. Warm from something the wood had taken in over 36 winters and held the way old wood holds things, not releasing them, not displaying them, just keeping them in the grain. She pressed her palm flat against the pine and held it there. She thought about what her mother had told her of that first night, the latch clicking into place in the dark, the cold pressing against the walls, the long wait for the warmth to come. She had been 4 years old. She remembered it as warmth in darkness, in the sound of her mother's heart against her ear, which was not the whole story but was the part that had lasted. The cold had been there. The storm had been outside doing what it was going to do, regardless of what anyone inside wanted. And her mother had built a box, and the box had held, and in the morning they had both been alive to open the door and step out into a frozen world that had not managed to reach them. Some things you build in the middle of not knowing if they will work. You build them because the alternative is waiting, and waiting in a situation that is deteriorating is not patience, but surrender. Agnes Holt had not been patient in the winter of 1887. She had been precise. She had used the measurements her grandmother had passed to her without knowing she was passing them on in the way that grandmothers in small houses pass things on by doing them in front of children who are paying the kind of attention that children pay when the thing being done is the thing keeping them alive. She had arrived with $9 and a child and a pipe held together with wire. She had stayed because there was no money to leave. She had built a box because her grandmother had built one in Illinois in a winter that required it, and she had remembered the dimensions correctly, and the dimensions had been enough. The child did not freeze in her bed. Agnes Holt did not watch it happen. What she watched instead for 35 more winters after the morning, she pushed open the box door and stepped out into the ice, and the silence was the sun coming up over the eastern horizon, and the smoke beginning to rise from the chimneys of the neighboring farms. And Clara growing into herself in the way Thomas had written about in careful penmanship on 3 pages of a letter that Agnes had read 37 times and could have recited from memory, and the prairie in its seasons, which were not kind but were consistent, which was a quality Agnes Holt understood and respected because she shared it. The box held. That was all. That was everything.